Welcome to the British Library. My name is Maya Marichowicz. I'm Director of Science and Innovation here at the British Library. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our third debate in the series of our AI debates, and the last one in this series, but we will be coming with the new series, probably in the autumn 25, so watch this space. Just a few practical notices from me before we dive into our event. Just to let you know, we don't have any fire alarms planned. If there is one, please exit the same way you came on the piazza. We are not planning anything like that, so just the notice we have to give. We are recording tonight, so later on when it comes to audience participation and questions, you might want not to be recorded. If that's the case, let us know. Feel free to ask the questions. Just let us know later on that you don't want to be recorded. And we put these videos on YouTube later on for other people to enjoy and look at. So I think that's probably all we have in terms of practicalities. We have our lovely panel that I'm going to invite onto the stage. Our chair tonight and for all our AI debates so far is lovely Timandra Harkness, who is going to introduce you to the panel. But I'll just tell you that Timandra is the writer and author and broadcaster and all good things. There's an excellent book to read called Technology is Not a Problem. I'll leave Timandra to tell you what is the problem. and you can often hear her on various programs on telly or on the radio. So panel, please come onto the stage.
Thank you.
Please do give them a big hand.
Great, it's great to see so many of you here. Thanks for coming out. Instead of sitting outside a pub, having a beer outside on a nice day, thinking, I thought it'd be warmer, but now the sun's gone down, it's actually a bit chilly. Perhaps that's why you are here. Perhaps it turned a little cold and you came. So we have a fantastic panel with really well-informed and varied opinions. So we're going to get short introductions from them, and then I will probably monopolise them for a few minutes to ask them my questions, and then we will come out and we should have plenty of time for you to express your opinions as well. Don't feel you have to shoehorn your opinion into the form of a question. This is a debate, so we're interested in what you think and getting a discussion going. So let me introduce the panel in the order in which they're going to speak. We have Lucy Crompton-Reid, who joined Wikimedia UK as the chief executive in October 2015. Wow, coming up for nearly 10 years. There you are, somebody's applauding you just for that. It's good, it's good. We've got a good spirit going on, I can tell. So she's spearheaded a new focus on knowledge equity on Wikipedia and the other Wikimedia departments. So maybe we can find out a bit more about what that is, I hope. And previous roles include Director at Apples and Snakes, the UK's largest live literature organisation, Head of Outreach and Public Engagement at the House of Lords, and other jobs at the Arts Council England and the British Refugee Council. So really, really varied history. And also sits on the British Library Advisory Council. So if there's anything you really feel the British Library should be doing, sidle up to her in the bar afterwards and maybe have a word, buy her a drink. There you go. It's official from the horse's mouth. Next, we're going to hear from Dan Williams, who is an assistant professor in philosophy at the University of Sussex and an associate fellow at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge, where he was a research fellow at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, before that. Works largely in the philosophy of mind, cognitive science and social epistemology, and his research examines in particular why people believe what they do and the social and political contexts within which people form and share beliefs. And finally, Dr. John Zerilli, am I saying your surname right?
Exactly right.
Good. Dr. John Zerilli is a philosopher and legal scholar with a very interesting career history, interesting cognitive science and artificial intelligence, currently a senior lecturer in digital law at King's College London and, slightly confusingly in this context, programme director of King's online LL.M in digital law, which is not a large language model. It's actually, what is an LL.M?
Master of Laws.
It's a Master of Law. Okay, so it's a master's course in law. But started off his career as a lawyer before going into getting a PhD in cognitive science and philosophy, previously at the Universities of Oxford, Cambridge and Edinburgh, was called to the Sydney Bar in 2011, So again, another law thing that would mean something different in a different context. And his two most recent books are The Adaptable Mind and A Citizen's Guide to Artificial Intelligence, which brings us perfectly on to the topic of this evening's debate, the third of our AI debates, and like all three, in fact, has become only more topical since we started planning them. So I'm sure you all have many thoughts about how AI and democracy do and don't interact. So I'm going to let the panel give us their thoughts, and then I will come out and see what you think as well. So Lucy, would you like to start us off with a concise but not rushed introduction to all your ideas about AI and democracy?
I will try. Thank you. I'm afraid the 10 years have taken their toll and I now have to wear glasses, which is sad. So Anna, I'm going to use notes, mainly to keep me on track, but really pleased to be here and part of this debate and look forward to the discussion and the input from the audience later. Almost exactly a year today, I was on this stage giving a keynote at the British Libraries Press Play Conference, which was billed as a celebration of libraries and all things digital. And in my talk, I focused a lot on trust and connection. And I want to come back to that theme, trust, today, because trust is essential to a functioning democracy. We need to trust in the processes of democracy, whether that's at the ballot box and me having faith that my vote is going to count as much as yours and my neighbours, or in public policy making. We need to have trust in politicians, however challenging, they can sometimes make that for us, and trust in our political institutions. And finally, we absolutely have to trust the information that we're seeing, that we're reading, that we're watching, upon which we're basing decisions in terms of how to vote, which parties to support, which policies that we agree with. So AI may have a positive role to play in public policy making and in the effectiveness and efficiency of our institutions. I honestly don't think that there's much evidence to support that yet, but I am optimistic that we can harness AI for the public good in certain situations with its huge ability to process, sift, synthesize data and to make pretty good, accurate predictions based on that data. However, overall, I am afraid that AI represents a huge threat to our democracy and to democracies all over the world and ways in which I think we're just beginning to grapple with. And I want to highlight three issues, all of which I'm sure the audience will be familiar with. So the first, and perhaps the most obvious in this context, is the deliberate use of AI to create and proliferate and target misinformation and disinformation and to reinforce filter bubbles. That includes the domestic use of those tools to manipulate public perceptions and radicalize citizens, but also foreign actors seeking to influence elections for their own ends. The second issue that I want to highlight, which is separate but slightly related to that first one, is that AI can degrade democracy by bolstering authoritarian regimes and digital authoritarianism. So states are using these technologies for social control, for repression, for surveillance. And I think it's really important to note that these technologies are often developed in Western countries, and they represent a threat to established democracies as well as to existing authoritarian regimes. And then finally, in terms of the key issues that I wanted to highlight, we have the complexification and pollution of our information ecosystem and the dilution of our information ecosystem, all of which leads to an erosion of trust, as I mentioned earlier, in our politicians and in our political processes and institutions. And as a corollary of that loss of trust, we're seeing the erosion and the decrease of political engagement, which is also really vital to a functioning democracy. And as you'll note, I did used to work at the House of Lords, so I'm really engaged. I'm really committed to genuine participatory democracy. I do think there's a number of potential mitigants. There's no silver bullet to solve the issues that I've just highlighted, but I think alongside appropriate regulation, and we may dig into regulation later, but yes, I think there needs to be a reasonable regulatory framework for AI. But these different approaches will require a proactive and properly joined up approach across different actors and sectors, and they'll need to consider both technical and social solutions. So the first of these is around media and information literacy, including AI and data literacy delivered at scale. Wikimedia UK delivers work with educators and other partners to develop media and information literacy skills, and it's designed to enable people to critically evaluate information And our research showed that our initiatives, but others like this, can really increase citizen engagement in democratic processes. But this work needs to be not a poor relation of, not a cousin of regulation, but real support and funding. And school curricula need to explicitly include these literacies and skills as well. The second mitigation that I wanted to talk about was flipping the title of this debate on its head, the democratization of AI. So that might include the provision of public AI infrastructure, a shared strategy for developing public generative AI models, and perhaps the development of industry standards for the safe disclosure of model weights and related AI assets. But democracy is fundamentally a human endeavour, and so my final point is to stress the importance and value of Wikimedia's continued commitment to humans being at the centre of content creation, moderation and governance in an information landscape that has become a minefield of machine-generated content. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Dan, are you concerned about the threat to democracy from AI?
I think that there are reasons for concern. I think there's so many things to say about this topic that it's difficult to fit anything within 5 minutes.
You can have 6 if you like.
Okay, perfect. That'll be enough. So I thought what I'd do is really take the kind of opposite viewpoint and explain why I think so much of the discourse surrounding AI and democracy is excessively negative, alarmist, and catastrophizing. I think over the past few years, there's been this enormous outpouring of concern that AI-based disinformation specifically poses a kind of existential threat to democracy. And people here point to things like the use of deepfakes, so using AI to create hyper-realistic fake audio and video to deceive people, micro-targeting when you sort of trawl through social media data to create hyper-personalized propaganda, the use of large language models to create very effective propaganda at a low cost. And I think the worry is that these sorts of applications are going to result in the sort of mass manipulation of voter opinion in ways that will undermine the legitimacy of democratic election results. So just to give you one example of this, the World Economic Forum, over the past 2 years running, has listed misinformation and disinformation as the top global risk in the immediate future, primarily due to these fears about AI. And I think even though there definitely are things to worry about and be concerned about and to think about in this area, for the most part, these concerns are massively overblown. So if you look at the most recent global election cycle between 2023 and 2024, when nearly half the world's population went to vote, there's simply not good evidence that AI-based disinformation played a significant role in shaping voter attitudes. So what's going on in these cases? I think there are sort of several psychological and social factors that end up distorting the public conversation and making it excessively negative. And I thought I'd just briefly go through them at the beginning, and then maybe we can sort of return to them in more depth later on. One of these is what psychologists call negativity bias, and it's just the fact that human attention is disproportionately grabbed by threats and dangers relative to benefits and opportunities. So when it comes to AI discourse, we tend to attend to the discourse about dangers, and we dwell on worst-case scenarios, and we end up ignoring the fact that the overwhelming majority of use cases of AI in democracy are mundane and benign, and very often incredibly beneficial. That then interacts with the second factor, which is when it comes to media and pundits and public intellectuals, I think their incentives are often to talk about this issue in ways that are sensationalized and alarmist. So these days we hear a lot about how social media algorithms maximize engagement in ways that are antithetical to healthy discourse on the platforms, which I think is correct. But we don't talk enough about how when pundits and public intellectuals and mainstream media covers these issues, they're also competing for attention. And the best way of competing for attention is to come up with the most catastrophizing narratives possible. And I think that interacts with another thing, which is that, strangely enough, in many of these cases, AI companies actually benefit from these narratives about the dangers posed by their technology because they benefit from hype. And this narrative that AI is an existential threat either to humanity or to democracy, underlying it is this idea that these technologies are incredibly powerful, which ultimately benefits their bottom line. And then there's a third thing, a final thing, which I think in some ways is the most important thing, which is what psychologists refer to as the third person effect. And it's just this idea that people tend to think people, and more specifically other people, it's never oneself, are gullible. So when you ask people, do you think that you're being manipulated by AI-based disinformation? Do you think it's changing your vote in a democracy or anything else about you? They say, of course not. I'm very sophisticated in terms of how I evaluate information. But then you say, do you think it might be manipulating other people? And they say, of course, because other people are credulous and they're very easy to manipulate. And that's just wrong. There's lots of psychological research showing that actually people are very sophisticated in terms of how they use these technologies and in terms of how they evaluate information. And contrary to conventional wisdom, people are not, on the whole, gullible and easy to manipulate. We can all think of exceptions to that, and there are cases where people are manipulated, but we tend to systematically exaggerate how influenceable people are when it comes to these technologies. So none of that is to say that there's nothing to worry about, and I agree with much of what Lucy said. There are significant risks here to think about, but I think precisely because so much of the conversation has been negative and alarmist and catastrophizing, it actually undermines our ability, I think, to think carefully about those risks, which is hopefully what we can do this evening. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan. Now remember, don't be too credulous about anything that the speakers say this evening, if only because you'd just be proving Dan wrong. So, John, what have you got for us?
So I won't talk about misinformation and disinformation, so I'll bracket that for a moment, very large bracket. But I'll take a somewhat middle ground between the two views that you've heard tonight. But I'll do so by focusing on one particular example, which is politically targeted advertising. So there was a case in 2010, an experiment that Facebook ran, and you can read about it in Nature. It was published in the journal Nature. And in this experiment, Facebook basically sent a bunch of get out to vote messages to a group of people and then gave the same message. It wasn't telling them how to vote, it was just telling them to get out and vote. Sent the same message to another group of people with an important difference. The difference was that in the second category, you had the get out to vote message, but people that were looking at that would see the thumbnails of friends, Facebook friends of theirs, who had already voted. And the difference in turnout was very substantial. So you could show exactly the same message, which is just, please go and vote. And those who got that message, but with, you might call it something like peer pressure or social contagion, I don't know how you would describe it, but those who got the message with their friends having been indicated as having voted already turned out in much larger numbers. And it turned out that the numbers were so significant, the absolute numbers, not the percentages, but the absolute numbers were so significant that they could actually have decided the election. Because when you're talking about blocks of 60,000 votes more, you can really turn things around. So I use that example because as far as we know, Facebook, Meta, hasn't used that facility that it has at its disposal. It could, in theory, I think, target people who it knows are likely to vote a certain way, and without telling them how to vote, and so therefore really without manipulating them at all, it can, you might think, under the right conditions, determine who actually gets elected by just making sure that an extra 60 or 70,000 people from that group turn out. That could sway the result. I think most of us would be horrified if we thought that Facebook was doing that and was actually calculating who it would prefer to be in office because that person would be favourable to its own agenda. That would be, I think, for most of us, morally repugnant. But let me give you another example, but with a twist. So, for as long as we've had political parties, they have been focused on two main tasks. One is finding out who supports them, and secondly, trying to get those people that it knows supports them, get them out to vote. So these are two really important tasks for political parties traditionally. In the country that I was born in Australia, the second of those is not relevant at all, because Australia has compulsory voting, so you never have to worry about people not turning out. So all the effort is spent on convincing the swinging voter, the person who could go either way. And actually that acts as a way to inoculate the system from extremes and from fanatical excess, because you never have to worry about people turning out to vote. But back in the UK and in the US and in most countries where voting is not compulsory, that's where the effort goes, getting people out to vote. Now, I think most of us in the room would not have a problem, I would have thought, with political parties working out from postcodes where their likely supporter base is. You might have a problem with it, but I think most of us don't. And anyone who has ever voted for a party implicitly is okay with that, because every political party does it. Whether they're small micro parties or whether they're larger established parties, they all do this. They work out who is likely to vote for them, and then having figured that out, they then send people, whether it's through door knocking or letterboxing, they send people to implore those people to go out to vote. We don't think that that's wrong, necessarily. Let me give you a third example, and I'll finish on this. We all know who Taylor Swift is. We all know if she tells people to go and vote in an election in the US, that there's a good chance that a significant number of people in absolute, not in percentage terms, but in absolute numbers, a significant number of people who will vote, and we can probably hazard a guess how they'll vote. They'll probably vote in the same way that she would vote, and we know how she would vote. So these are three examples. The Facebook one mortifies us. The example of political parties doing the same thing, finding out who votes for them and then going after them, so micro-targeting by another name, that one doesn't seem to raise our hackles. And then the third example is Taylor Swift. And that one I would leave to you, whether you think that knowing the power that she has and the influence she has, whether you think that that is a legitimate use of her power in her society, being so outsized as it is, when she tells people that they should go out and vote without telling them who to vote for. So those are the three examples, and I just want to make one point to finish, which is, personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with working out who is your voter base and using whatever methods you can to work that out with as great a precision as you can manage. I don't think it's then wrong to implore those people, once you've identified them, to go out and vote. And yet something has to give, because Facebook seems like it's, if not outright electoral interference, there's something about it, and I don't think it's necessarily because groups are being manipulated, but there's something about it that does upset us and suggests that the power of companies as large as Facebook and with the resources of Facebook should somehow be reined in. So I just leave that with you.
Thank you very much, John. I am actually really curious. I think your three examples are really interesting. So let's do a little show of hands. Who in the room would actually feel comfortable with Facebook doing a get out and vote campaign more or less targeted to people who Facebook would like to get out and vote? Who would feel comfortable with that? Yeah, okay. People think this is fair enough. It's mobilising. Who feels comfortable with political parties targeting? And all the political parties do this through social media. I mean, they will be doing it through Facebook, identify the people, messaging those people saying, oh, you should get out and vote. Who feels comfortable with that being done through digital means? Quite a big majority, not quite everybody, but most people. And who feels comfortable with celebrities using their influence on their audiences to tell them to go and vote? Okay, I'd say that was about the same as the political parties. Interesting. Okay, so I just want to, before I come out and get your thoughts on this, I do just want to throw a few things to and fro, because I think we've got some really interesting points of divergence emerging here. So maybe to come back to you first, Lucy, since you've had the longest to take in and think about everybody else. I mean, you're worried about misinformation and mass manipulation, and that's kind of what has been picked up throughout this, the idea that because AI is capable of identifying people who may have particular opinions, people who may get out and vote or not get out and vote, and therefore essentially making political campaigning much more individually targeted and effective than ever before in an age where we do so much digitally. Is there something about it that is really different from what's been done before? Or is it simply that it can be done more effectively, more quickly, more cheaply, and on a bigger scale?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable question, because propaganda and misinformation and fake news were not invented in the last decade. I think, for me, though, there is the sort of exponential increase that we are seeing and that AI and other digital technologies are facilitating, which is particularly troubling. But it's also that it's not just about misinformation, it's about this whole many ways in which our information environment is being degraded. And misinformation, well, the way I see the difference between misinformation and disinformation, I tend to consider disinformation as being to be very deliberate, malicious, often, but not always, state-led. Misinformation, I see misinformation all the time on Facebook. I mean, I'm interested by your credibility point, because credulity, I'm not even going to attempt to say that word. Credulity, thank you. I see people sharing things all the time like, looked at that. I mean, misinformation can just be your mate sharing something that they think you might be interested, but they haven't realised that actually it's a racist group that's produced this, and they've sort of not really looked under the lid as to what's going on. So it's absolutely prolific in a way that I certainly didn't experience previously. And I think that it's not AI is the problem, right? It's AI can accelerate things for good and bad. But I don't know if this is the answer in your book, because I haven't read it, but people are the bloody problem, aren't they?
Yeah.
Right? So it's that these tools, in the hands of the wrong people, can be incredibly dangerous. And there is a lot of wrong-uns about in powerful positions at the moment, either in technology companies or in governments. So this is my concern. It's not per se the technology, but AI can massively accelerate and amplify. And something I didn't have time to talk about in my 5 minutes was that the other thing that AI does is that it reinforces and amplifies bias, because AI is just trained on historic data sets, all of which, or the vast majority of which, are incomplete, they're biased, they have missing stuff, and that is just perpetuated in the AI. And in future, particularly as AI gets harder to detect, future AIs are going to be trained on existing AIs, and so just sort of amplifying and reinforcing those errors and mistakes. And even in a good use case, right? Even when there's nothing malicious, there's no intent around misinformation and disinformation. There are huge problems in my view.
So Dan, let's take at face value your suggestion that people are not as gullible as, or other people are no more gullible than we think ourselves to be. Maybe let's put it that way. That people are not as gullible as we sometimes think they are. That they're actually quite hard to convince of things. that they don't already think. But what about this other problem, that in fact the problem is not that people are too willing to trust dodgy sources, but that with the proliferation of unreliable source material, people will become unwilling to trust anything or anybody, and that when you look out into the digital landscape and there's so many different opinions and points of view and alternative facts, that you just become very cynical about the whole thing and think, well, what is truth anyway? What is information? Nobody can know anything. I'm just going to go with my gut feeling. Do we not need some kind of shared idea of what is true about the world in order to then begin to have political disagreements?
I think we do. I think what I'd push back against is the idea that artificial intelligence specifically is something that has exacerbated that, or that there used to be a golden age of objectivity where people agreed on the facts and then we had perfectly thoughtful and reasonable disagreement against that backdrop. I don't think that's ever existed. And I think if you look today at the sources of lies and propaganda, they're people. And actually, I think it's true that AI systems can embody certain kinds of biases, but I think the question is always, well, compared to what? I mean, if you compare, I'll give you a really interesting example. So I think if you take someone like Elon Musk, my own view is he's a liar. I think a vast amount of the content that he disseminates on his platform and elsewhere is wrong, or it's a half-truth, or it's a propaganda message, or something else which is not concerned with truth and honesty, but with manipulating people. On his platform, there's a large language model that he's now embedded onto the platform, and I understand many people have left the platform for understandable reasons, called Grok. Now, if you ask Grok who is the most prolific spreader of misinformation on the platform, it will tell you Elon Musk. So what does that tell us? Yes, these systems are subject to biases, but I would put it to you that ChatGPT as a system, for all of its flaws, is less biased than the average voter. So it's always a matter of thinking not just about what are the problems with the technology, but contextualizing them and always asking compared to what. And also, I think, for all of the problems that we confront today, the overwhelmingly sort of largest threat to democracy is demagogues appealing in emotional ways to the base instincts of low information voters, which is exactly what Plato worried about in the Republic over 2,000 years ago. It's not a specific issue with technology. So it's not as if I'm suggesting there's nothing to worry about. I think there are things to worry about. What I'll just push back against is this idea that we should look specifically at things like AI as the source of the problems that we confront, when actually I think they're much deeper and for the most part aren't technology-based.
That's interesting. And I'm kind of interested in, if you think that that's not where we should be looking, why you think that people keep coming back to the suggestion that it is. But I'm going to come back to that later on, but maybe park that and have a think about it. So, John, I'm really, really interested in the stuff that you were talking about. This is something that I have actually looked at a few times, in fact, in my books, and dug into things like the Cambridge Analytica panic, as I would call it. But the thing that does, so I share your kind of feeling that using digital methods and AI methods to target voters for political campaigns is simply a new way of doing what's done to some extent. But there is one thing that concerns me, and I'd be interested to know your thought about it, and it's the fact that in a kind of pre-digital age, political campaigning was done in a much more mass way, in ways that we would tend to receive the same message. So everybody who read the same newspaper would get the same message. And obviously there's different newspapers, but you would have a large constituency of people getting the same political messages as well as the same factual content. And so you would have an idea of what other people were seeing as well as what you were seeing. And it strikes me that the one thing that is really genuinely new about the hyper-personalised political messaging is that you might get a completely different political campaign message from the same political party as the one that I'm getting. So what I think I'm going to get if I vote for a political party might be completely different from what you think you're going to get. And that means that if we wanted to have a discussion about which way we're going to vote, we're not talking the same language necessarily. We don't have the common ground. So that's the aspect of it that really concerns me, that I think is tied to the technology in a way that a lot of this other stuff isn't. Is that something that I should be concerned about?
So, I mean, I began my little disquisition by saying that I was going to bracket misinformation and disinformation. And in a way, the kind of epistemic fracturing that you're talking about, where we're all seeing slightly different things, or maybe not so slightly different things, suggests to me that there is deception going on, that someone is being told something here, they're being told something else there, and depending on how many different views or messages there are, how many you accumulate, eventually they can't all be true, so there are lies somewhere in the midst. And I wanted to bracket that because as soon as you do get misinformation and disinformation, then we have the problems that you've already been discussing. If the use of the technology is regulated in a way that prohibits certain types of messaging, and I know it's hard to regulate political advertising, but there have been attempts in the past and in my own country where truth in political advertising was something that was taken seriously and was brought as a matter before the Parliament to legislate upon. I'm not going to say that that's easy, but if we can regulate the environment in a way that mitigates the worst excesses of misinformation, then I think there is scope for using AI to do this sort of thing. But I completely understand the point about epistemic fracture. Just to say one thing, though, against myself, and I guess against Dan maybe too, depends. One use that I think the technology does, one use that I think is genuinely different is the scale of propagation. So before you had to sort of just rely on human feet to carry the message into the letterboxes bit by bit. It was painstaking, it was tiresome. You could do phone calling, cold canvassing. These are techniques that were used, but the algorithms that we have now make it extremely easy to get to everyone you need to get to with no effort at all. And that means that if there is any misinformation, it propagates very quickly. And it only takes a very, very small percentage of people to succumb to the deception to potentially change an election result. The study that I mentioned that Facebook ran back in 2010, in absolute terms, we were talking about 60,000 or 70,000, but in relative terms, as percentages, the differences were quite small. They were like 1% or even less. But yet, when you're dealing across populations that are very large, 1% of 200 million is quite a lot. So the technology gives you a kind of scale of propagation that means even tiny, exiguous differences that are taken up by only a very, very, very small percentage of the community can still have very large ramifications at the higher level. And that's something that isn't accounted for or isn't sort of easily dismissed simply by pointing out that people aren't as gullible as you think they are. They might well not be as gullible, but there still only needs to be maybe 0.4% of the people who do succumb to get really large absolute numbers at the population level. So that is a danger in the technology that I think needs to be appreciated. Not that Dan is or I have suggested that there's nothing to worry about, but that's just something.
And of course, the other change there is that whereas previously political parties had to motivate enough members and activists to get out on the doorstep,
Yep.
now you just need a few people in a room with some computers. So a relatively small number of committed people can have a relatively large influence.
I'm reliably informed by someone that is deeply involved in a political party in Scotland and he has years of experience in that party, the parties are not very good yet at making use of the technology when it comes to either isolating who it is that supports them or imploring them to go out and vote. So the parties themselves are not very good at this, but that's not to say that private actors and more wily folk that maybe are not part of established institutions like political parties aren't more savvy.
Can I make a small point on this?
Yeah, do.
Which is that, as we saw from the room, actually most people don't really have a problem with political parties using whatever technologies or tools are at hand to convey their message, because that's what they, as you pointed out, it's one of the things they're set up to do, and we all know that. And there's an understanding that, you know, my local political parties are going to try and sort of get a sense of whether I would vote for them and then reach me, right? I think that's fine. The thing that's so insidious about your Facebook example is that if Facebook had a banner that everyone saw that said, get out to vote today, you know, in a particular geographic territory, I don't have a problem with that because I want people to get out and vote wherever you live, right? And however you vote, that's fine, that's up to you. But this idea that Facebook could use something that's such a positive, almost sort of virtue signalling kind of thing to encourage the vote, but actually use their knowledge of those different audiences to sway the vote. That, and they're a company. They have no right to do that. A political party, that is literally what they're there to do. Facebook or any other company may have a view, and they will have a view as to which political party will be more beneficial for them. It's fine for them to have that view, but to use that influence that they have to drive vote and potentially, you know, steal an election, in my view, is unconscionable.
Okay, really useful distinction. So I'm going to come out and get your thoughts. And as usual, when I chair these things, I'm going to get 2 or 3 different thoughts from different people and then come back to the panel. So basically, that will give more time, hopefully, for people in the audience to have a say, because we won't have one question, everybody answers it, and so on. Anyway, you get the idea. As Maya said at the beginning, this is going to be recorded and put out on social media later on YouTube. So if you want to speak, but you've lied about where you are, you said you've gone out on the lash with your friends and actually you're at a debate on AI and democracy, the British Library or something. We're not here to judge you. Just say at the beginning, just say, please edit me out, and then just say whatever you want to say, because we want to hear what you've got to say. So I think there's a roving microphone somewhere, if not 2. Great, there's a hand right down the front. This is always the way. See, the person, the microphone at the back. Person put their hands up at the front. If there's somebody else who wants to put their hand up, we'll get the other microphone to you. So, yes, good. Okay, so we get the other microphone to that person, and then when you're finished, we'll get up there. Far away.
My question is really, have we lost the art of critical thinking? Did we ever have it? Do we need to rediscover it? Because I receive an awful lot of stuff, and when I look at something, I want to go away and test it against a number of different areas. I'm one who's always looking at different data sets and can I reconcile them? Of course, 2 things. One, it takes an awful lot of time. Occasionally, often I receive something say, you know, here's the result of a chi-squared test. I don't understand it. Could someone tell me what the conclusion is, please? Which I shouldn't really say. But also, if I look at something, I'm saying, this is it. I've heard this point of view an awful lot of times. Is this right? What is the other point of view? Am I different? Should we teach people to actually question the data? Is it going to be easy to do that?
Great, very good point. And I'd be interested to hear what all the panel think about that. Somebody up there has the microphone. And if anyone else wants to speak at this point, stick your hand up and we'll get the other microphone to you. Off you go.
Hi there. Good evening. Thank you very much for the comments so far. Just quickly back to your sort of 3 actors issue. I'd agree entirely with it's fine for political parties to go out and do it because that's the game. We expect them to do it. We almost poke fun at it now in modern society about what they've put in their leaflets and the spot the lies sort of thing. I share the concerns around kind of Facebook and stuff mobilising people because they're not part of the game. They are, in fact, being bought off, and I disagree with the dupability of people. I think a lot of people will just go with things because someone on TikTok, someone on Facebook has said it. And then with the kind of Taylor Swift thing, there's almost a split there with if she's a US national influencing a US election, that's okay, but when they start influencing other nations' kind of activities, you're almost crossing a line there. Again, we've seen that in previous things historically about one nation getting involved in another. That's when you start to get cries of foul. The question, and I apologise for going on, is more about, we've talked about using AI to attain power. What about AI to keep power? And I'm particularly interested in your thoughts about the government of the day here talking about using more AI in its governmental processes while cutting perhaps members of the civil service out who are by nature apolitical. And how would you balance that when government itself probably isn't going to create those AI models, but they are going to be commercial off the shelf or variations of that are built by companies with an agenda and their own biases?
Another very good point. Is there, just before I come back to the panel, could I get the microphone up to... You're coordinating to be deliberately as far apart as possible, aren't you? It's like our poor microphone runners. and then I'll come back and let you all three have a...
Hi, thank you. I was just curious, and I'm coming from the perspective of sharing every concern that has been mentioned so far from the panellists and the audience too. But I was curious about if you could talk about if there's any way in which AI can improve or bring about democracy, as well as all of the negative things you've talked about, perhaps in the realm of how it can help to hold people in power to account. There's a positive story here too.
Brilliant, admirable and concise. Okay, so now the hands are really coming up. So if you'd like to pass the microphone forward 2 rows, so that, get your hand up, that's it. And then I'll come back to the panel, and then I will come to you next.
I teach at a university, and all my students are using AI in some form or the other. Critical thinking, love that question. And they're using AI to help them with their critical thinking, but also from a mental health perspective. A lot of my students say to me, I'm having a bad day, I'll ask this AI what I should do. I'll ask Pi. Pi is a nice AI. I'll ask Pi, I'm having a bad day, what should I do? And increasingly, I see people, loneliness, pandemic, the way that we are living, turning to AI for advice on what they should do. And I wonder, as we grow in our use of AI, does it undermine our trust in people?
That is a great question. And I was actually going to say, when I come back out, I'm very interested to hear what... Okay, hang on to the microphone, and I'll come back to you when I've heard from the panel, because I don't want to take so many questions they've forgotten. So come back to you, and then if we get that microphone to that lady at the end of that row, so that when the panel have finished, we have 2 people with microphones all ready to go. And I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts about trust and regulation, because these are themes that keep coming back. So, panel, have we actually lost the art of being able to critically evaluate things full stop? But also, we have to recognise it's very time-consuming to actually go back to the sources of things and check them for yourself. Do we really have the time for that? What about AI to keep power, to run the state? Is this something we should be concerned about, or is it indeed a plus that it can take work away that we don't need people to do? Can AI improve democracy in any way? And if we're using AI for advice, is that putting too much trust in AI and not enough trust in other human beings? So who would like to kick off? Don't all feel you have to answer everything. Answer the things you're most interested in. You're raring to go, aren't you?
I mean, raring is perhaps an overstatement, but yeah, thank you. Fantastic questions. I did some reading around the subject, obviously, before coming tonight, but there are things that I wish I ingested that a little bit more. And sharpened my own critical thinking skills. But one of the things that a colleague sent me a few weeks ago was a piece of research that suggests quite strongly that AI is leading to a deterioration of critical thinking skills. But I don't think we've lost them. I think your question was, have we lost the art of critical thinking? We haven't lost it, but it's so important. So I think as part of the information and media literacy and AI literacy initiatives that I mentioned in my introductory talk, building critical thinking skills is absolutely a vital component of that. I don't know that I have an answer to the Taylor Swift, but it did make me chuckle slightly internally that I think I do know how Taylor Swift would vote, and yet I could not name you a single Taylor Swift song. So riddle me that. And then there are a couple of almost sort of oppositional questions, and one was about using AI to keep power, and one was about using AI to improve democratic processes. And I think both are possible, actually. I mean, because as we've discussed, it is essentially just a tool. I would like to say that I think the current move by Labour to embed more AI is I mean, I don't have any skin in the game. I'm not a member of the party, but I think it is driven by a need to create efficiencies rather than a sort of Machiavellian attempt to keep power. But that doesn't mean to say that it can't be used in that way. But as I mentioned again in my intro, I haven't really seen any convincing evidence that AI actually is improving public policy and is an effective tool. So I would like to see a bit more evidence that it's going to be able to replace those civil servants in a way that's meaningful and creates better policy making. And I'm not sure that that's there. I went to a Chatham House thing about 18 months ago, and it was exactly to your point about how AI can be used to improve democratic systems. And there are a number of examples, and Taiwan and Sweden are both in my head, but I don't think I could share more specifically what's going on. But yeah, I think there are some examples, but for me they're sort of snippets and pockets. And I think on the whole, it's more of a threat. But that, of course, as Dan said, we can't catastrophize about it so much that we don't think of the positive use cases and think about ways to manage the risk. And then the trust thing. It's really benign, isn't it? You ask AI, I'm having a bad day, and AI says, maybe go for a walk in the fresh air. There's nothing wrong with that, but I worry that where's these people's sort of social network, not in a Facebook sense, but in a texting a friend or even calling a housemate, saying, I feel really crap today, and them saying, why don't I go for a walk with you? So I don't think there's anything wrong per se in that use of AI, but for me, it's about the whole instead of what. It's replacing human interaction, which actually is really fundamental to mental health. So,
I like that instead of what. That's great. Okay, let me reiterate.
Sorry, I didn't.
Don't feel you have to answer all of them.
It's because I've done my homework and made notes.
Yes, that's very good. Okay, who is it, John?
So I'll just pick up on the Taylor Swift thing again, because I was intrigued by your response before about this is what political parties do. Yeah. The understanding is that this is what they do, that's their job, so it's okay. Facebook's not in that category. But then it got me thinking, but Taylor Swift is not in that category either. She doesn't exist for the very purpose of getting people into power, or getting herself into power.
Or does she?
Or does she? So I think there's something there that's right about why we are uncomfortable about one example, but it's still difficult to articulate what it is exactly that's so troubling about, or there's something about the others that doesn't seem troubling. Political parties definitely, but even the Taylor Swift case doesn't seem troubling, and yet she is not in the position of a political party. She doesn't exist, as I say, to have that influence. So I'm just interested in whether you could say a little more about that, but that's at another stage.
Personally, yeah. I'm much less comfortable with Taylor Swift with Taylor Swift doing it
than a political party.
But I'd rather Taylor Swift did it than Facebook. Yeah, so that's where it is on my side.
Yeah, that's probably the right approach. It's like it's a gradient.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And the only thing I'll speak to the point by the gentleman at the back about the use of AI in government as an instrument of power. So in Edinburgh, when I was at Edinburgh University, I ran a course that was entirely about that. And that ran for, however many weeks it did. So it's hard to reduce all that into an answer. But to your point, Lucy, there is very little evidence that the AI is very good at doing routine, process-driven administrative things that you would think it would be good at. Like, we know that it's not good at things that humans do, which is like love, care, compassion. We know that. But even the stuff that it's supposed to be good at, it gets horribly wrong. And anyway, you all know about the Verizon Royal Mail scandal. I mean, that wasn't sophisticated AI, admittedly, but even the more sophisticated versions of it have led to terrible situations. There's another case in Australia called Robodebt. Robodebt is Robodebt is the Australian equivalent of your Royal Mail Verizon scandal. Is it Verizon? Or
Horizon.
Horizon.
Yeah, no, Verizon.
Verizon with a V?
I thought it was Horizon. Oh.
Oh, no, yeah, no,
it's
Verizon.
Ver-
Program is Horizon.
One of those.
Sorry, yes, Fujitsu. Horizon,
Yeah. So they have their version. There's another version of it in the States as well, in one of the states in the US. So that's how I would summarize it. The technology is not yet good enough. I don't have a problem with it, like Lucy doesn't have a problem with it necessarily to make things more efficient. But every time you hear the word, let's make things efficient, I mean, I don't know of an example where that has preceded a period in which things have run more smoothly. I'm not sure of an example where that's actually gone to plan. Maybe we'll get there, but precedent so far is lacking.
Dan, as well as all the audience questions, why is it that people who like Taylor Swift's music and watching on stage would therefore vote the way that they think she might want to vote?
I'm not sure that they would. I'd like to see a study of that. She did come out in defense of endorsing Kamala Harris in the last election. It would be interesting to study systematically whether that did in fact result in either a greater number of people coming out to vote or a greater number of people voting for Kamala Harris. I'm very sceptical that it would, but maybe it would. And if it would, that's because there are some people who really trust her. So it's not as if it would be irrational. I mean, they look up to her, they trust her as a reliable source of information, but I'm sceptical that it
Just
would
as it wouldn't be irrational for people on Facebook to go out and vote because they saw that their friends have done it already, that wouldn't necessarily be irrational either. Yeah.
But it's not an irrational decision for them, but it's not based on something substantive. No disrespect to Taylor Swift at all.
Yeah.
Also, just so that we all know, the US administration produced a deep fake of Taylor Swift endorsing Trump, right? So, that study would have to take that into account and understand whether there were Taylor Swift fans who saw that and didn't find out that it was a deep fake and didn't see her come out in support of Kamala Harris, right? So,
okay, I definitely want to study on this. If there's anyone in this room
We've talked about
who's
Taylor
a
Swift a lot more
PhD
than I thought we would
student
do in
looking
this
for a
debate.
topic, and maybe you could supervise it, or maybe you could supervise it. Anyway, I want this. I want to be back here in whatever 5 years' time with the results of this study. But for now, I feel perhaps we should park Taylor Swift, otherwise it's going to become a Taylor Swift evening. So Dan, what other things would you like to talk about that have come up?
Maybe I'll say something about the critical thinking point, and then maybe about the benefits of AI for democracy. So on critical thinking, I mean, it's an empirical question whether these technologies have hurt our capacity to evaluate information, and I'd be interested in that study you pointed to. I'm a little bit skeptical because I think we just forget the baffling things that people have believed throughout human history. Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds was a bestseller, I think it was in the 19th century. If you go back throughout the 20th century, like the incredibly, seemingly irrational, baffling, often fairly hateful things, theories, narratives that people have believed in on a large scale, it's very, very striking. So I think there is often too much of a nostalgia when we contrast the present with the past. I've got some issues with this term critical thinking because I think it encourages the view that the problem is people aren't skeptical enough of the content that they come across. Whereas I think actually in many of these cases, the problem is that people are too skeptical. They're far too disposed to reject anything at odds with their pre-existing beliefs. So when you find somebody that believes something, like let's say they're a conspiracy theorist and they endorse, baseless conspiracy theories, or they endorse incorrect views about vaccines, we tend to focus on the information that they've accepted, and we think, wow, they're really gullible to have accepted that. But we ignore the vast amount of information they must have rejected to have arrived at and maintained that kind of belief. And I think in many of these cases, that's really the bigger problem. They don't have trust in reliable, knowledge-generating institutions. And so what you need to do, rather than building up critical thinking, making people more skeptical, is to try to win trust in trustworthy institutions. And a large part of that, I think, is making these institutions more trustworthy, rather than putting the burden on the individual to become more skeptical. On the issue of AI benefiting democracy, so you mentioned the Taiwan example, and I think it's a great case study where AI is being used in innovative ways to address really profound problems with democracy and the lack of participation that you find in most actually existing democracies today. So one thing that AI is good at, and is going to get a lot better at, is summarizing and synthesizing large amounts of data. So if you have forums or message boards or places online where citizens can give their opinions about things, you can have 10,000, 100,000 comments. There's no way an individual politician or policymaker could look through all of those. But one thing that AI systems can be very good at is summarizing a large body of data, extracting points of agreement, common ground, parts of consensus, and so on. I also think another thing that AI is really good at is, and again, I think it's good at the moment, I think it's going to get better, is taking very disorganized, inchoate thoughts and transforming them into something which is clear and accessible. And I think that's a massive advantage to lots of citizens who have really important things to say, but maybe they don't have abilities to articulate themselves particularly clearly. Things like that, which I think often don't get enough attention when we think about democratic participation, but are incredibly important. These are clear cases where I think AI can be beneficial, and I think in some cases has been beneficial. And just, I think, again, I return to this point about the third person effect, like the way in which we always think that we're so different to everyone else. In my own case, I can't think of a single example where AI has been a disadvantage to me. But I can think of countless cases where I've massively benefited from AI advancements over the past several years. Really, really simple one is something like text-to-speech software, which has massively improved recently. It's greatly amplified my ability and many other people's ability to digest information just because of the way that our brains work. We find it much easier to acquire information in that format than via text. That's one example. I could give many, many other examples. So I suspect there are all of these cases where AI is already enhancing people's ability to become informed and to digest information, but they get overlooked because so much of the conversation is focused on the negatives and the alarmism in ways that I think end up meaning we don't have a kind of balanced picture of the overall package of effects.
Okay, good. So I know two people already have the microphones, so we'll hear from them first, and then we'll hear some more. And depending on how many people want to speak, and we may get another 2 rounds, or I may take a huge round and then come back and ask the panel to answer all of them and sum up. But meanwhile, you have a microphone, so we'll start with you, and then we'll come to you.
Thanks very much. Thoughts about quantity and quality. Luther nailed a piece of paper to a door. Hardly any quantity at all, but it had a huge impact. And so I'm interested on the panel's thoughts about AI producing vast amounts of information, but also in the Twitter sphere or the exosphere, whatever it's called now, so much is fleeting, and AI seems to be slowing us down looking at the data and reproducing it.
Oh, interesting. Okay, good. Thank you very much. So we'll go to you, and whoever else would like to speak, stick your hand up now. We'll get the microphone to you ready. Okay, so up there, and then we'll come down here. Off you go.
So some of these AI models are developed and owned by private entities, and all the data as well is inaccessible at the moment to the public. So I'm just wondering if you think that these sort of data sharing policies should be mandatory to sort of prevent monopolization by a select few entities.
Okay, interesting, great. And I'm loving how concise you all are as well. This is great. Keep it up. So somebody up there has the microphone. I think if you could get that one to this person here, ready, that would be great. Off you go, whoever. Yes, you.
Also like a policy sort of thing on 2 questions. Firstly, on like AI-generated content, if you think something like watermarking or provenance tagging would be a good thing that should be adopted by all immediately. And then secondly, on like curation with like social media and things like that, what policy options might exist to deal with that sort of troubling thing of Facebook modifying who receives what and when they receive it and how they receive it. Maybe the only thing that comes to my mind is making them liable for what's on their platform, but obviously they've up until this point aren't liable in any way, shape or form. So, yeah.
So you're thinking, I mean, you seem to be bringing out 2 thoughts there. One about the capacity of platforms using AI to target people, but the other one about the actual nature of the content that's there being shared.
Well, one on like generated content, generated by AI, and one on content curated by AI.
Great, thank you very much. Excellent. So again, somebody down here has the microphone. Yeah, off you go.
Hi. Really admired Dan's defence of AI, but I'm really curious because so far it's sort of depended on, the way the system has operated and the way things are now. But aren't we at an inflection point where this sophistication of the technology is such a threat to the system? Because if we think about what democracy relies upon, it relies on this person being valid and me believing in their views and wanting to support them. But if we can no longer trust in what we see, with the sophistication of videos, etc., that create situations that may not have existed, and they can, as to the gentleman's point up there, proliferate them in a way that you cannot regulate, you cannot contest that, then isn't that a different, aren't we in a different ball game, aren't we in a different phase?
Okay, another great question. All right, so was it a couple more? Okay, let's take, whoa. All right, so what we're gonna do, panel, pay lots of attention, all right? I am making illegible notes here, pay lots of attention. I'm gonna try and take everybody's points of questions that wants to make one, and then come back and you can answer everything and give us your summing up thoughts at once. And then we go out into the bar. All right, so there were three hands over here, and there was one over here somewhere. So maybe get one microphone to that person there, and the other one to one of these. Keep your hands up, keep your hands up. Where's the other microphone? Yeah, there you go. Okay, there you go. Gentleman in row 3.5, whatever that is, and then we'll work our way backwards. There, that's it. Okay, so have you got the microphone? Off you go.
Yeah, I was thinking about the point you made about why do we feel more troubled by the Taylor Swift example. And I don't know if other people would agree, but I feel like it's about the transparency, because you know that you're going to get leaflets through the post, or you know that political parties are going to target their voters. Taylor Swift making a comment, everyone, well, maybe not everyone, but a lot of people would be aware of that, whereas I think the thing that is troubling about the Facebook example is that you don't even know it's happened. So how do you combat that? And I think related to that, and kind of tagging on to some of the previous questions, is about the regulation. Like, is a sort of a big answer to this just more transparency and disclaimers about what is AI, and more information about how these algorithms are working in terms of like what information on their users have they used to target you with this ad? And maybe there should be more of an impetus on tech companies to also show a more balanced view, so that you're not just given one version of events.
Okay, so two definite proposals here. One for more transparency, and the other one that maybe tech companies should be treated a bit more like broadcasters are, and there should be an onus on them to show you a balanced diet of information. Great. So somebody there has the microphone, and if you'd like to take that microphone and give it to somebody else with their hand up. But meanwhile, okay, maybe if you could take yours up to the person up there while this person's speaking. Off you go.
Yeah, hi. I feel just a reflection on the difference between Taylor Swift and Facebook. I think one of the a key difference I feel might be about just the sheer size of Facebook. Like at this point, as a company, it's almost like, societal infrastructure. Something which I think Taylor Swift can only dream of, really. But, and she's not exactly using the data that she holds on everyone to in order to decide which of her fans to call out to vote. So I think that's just one observation on that. I feel in terms of AI itself and its relation to technology, it's probably a bit like social media, going to have some positives, for democracy, and it'll have some negatives, for democracy. I feel like the fate of democracy is far more likely to be shaped by those who make the AI, as in the leaders of the tech companies. And I guess my question on that is, given that all of those are, based in the US, how much of a say is the UK realistically going to be able to have on the fate of democracy?
Very good point. Well made. Thank you. So somebody up there, I think, has the microphone. If you'd like to fire away. And meanwhile, Yes, perfect, good.
Hi, so I'm study the sociology of digital media, include AI, and I just like to ask more about the fear towards AI and wondering, would you argue is another moral panic toward the new so-called new technology, and how should we think more rationally towards AI or like new technology in general?
Another great question. Is it just a moral panic? Fantastic. So you have the microphone. Good. And anyone else, put your hand up now. It's your last chance. Cool.
Yeah, it was quite interesting in what you said about your students, and it made me think of in ancient times how people would go to the muses for their, advice or information. And that just sort of threw me into that thought, and I thought, yeah, very similar. And also with democracy, I was thinking more along the lines of how most companies and most companies and bodies have their own kind of political biases, and I'm not explaining myself well, intentions. So I could be, I don't know, supporting a company or paying for something, and they're going to support a political political party anyway. So, whether it's AI or I'm just paying a company for their goods, they would be maybe filtering it towards their own purposes politically anyway. So I don't really see a lot
So
of
the
difference
division
there.
between political parties and companies is not a clean division anyway?
No.
Yeah. Good, thank you very much. Okay, so somebody, next to the student of sociology, and looks like you're going to get the last word from the audience, so make it really good, no pressure.
I'm another sociology student, but for the University of West England, and more just a thought piece on the Taylor Swift and Facebook and stuff, not to drag it out, but I think it's important to also recognise the demographic of her following and how that may intersect with the impact that her influence may have. So I think when we're comparing it to something like Facebook and how that may target, and gentleman on the left, you mentioned about how the absolute numbers that's a 60,000, 70,000 increase in potential voters. But I think it's important to realise that her demographic probably covers mainly white teenage girls who end up looking up to her in a different way. So her influence can be more damaging than Facebook because, like you said, she can end up getting a whole percentage, even if minimal, but a very noticeable, complete number of potential voters. So, yeah.
Excellent point. I love how, despite my best efforts, I blame you for this. You're the one who raised Taylor Swift. But it is actually, I think,
the theme of the evening.
But it is a really interesting example that you raised, because it does throw up this huge question of, well, why are we influenced by somebody like Taylor Swift? Do we think she has an influence, and so on? So. Fantastic questions. There's always one. It's like you wait and you wait and you wait. All right, we're going to take a very quick one from you, and then the panel are going to get like 4 minutes each to answer all the questions and sum up your thoughts, and then we go to the bar and have the informal discussion.
One is that I went to the launch of that book of Yuval Harari about the same issue basically. And he's a bit more tragic. And I'm a bit, because he says that basically the algorithms are controlling the information that we are receiving. And I'm surprised by how we are, what we are discussing here, that is kind of saying there is nothing to be worried about because this is not that big issue. On the other hand, about Facebook, I was surprised to see Mark Zuckerberg and all these big guys in Trump's possession, right? But he was surrounded by Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and all those guys. These guys control all the information and all the big data in the world, and for me that's a matter of being very, very, very concerned. And that's a threat to democracy because they are very close to power now. So I don't know if I'm missing something about what has been said, but I'm very worried. And that's what I want to say.
Okay, good. So the last word from the audience is, you're wrong, Dan, they are very worried. See, look, say his round of applause. People sitting there going, these people downplaying the threat to democracy. Okay, right, so I'm going to take you, I think, in reverse order. So you do literally have about, well, I'll give you maybe 5 minutes each, but definitely not more than that. And then we go out into the bar where informal discussion can continue. So, I mean, there's a lot about Taylor Swift. There's the argument that actually it's the quality that has impact. It doesn't matter about the scale and the quantity. I can't read my own handwriting. Should have got an AI to write it down for me. Is it just a moral panic? The trust issue. That can we trust the technology? Should we trust the technology? The point about demographics, that you can simply by influencing a particular demographic, that might change the political outcome. And does it matter that we don't have access to the data, either that AI is being trained on or that the data that it's using to target us? So again, please don't answer all of them, but try and answer all of them between you.
I promise you I won't answer all of them.
Good.
So I'll start with the point about the demographic that you made. I think it was the second last question up there. Yes, that was, maybe it didn't come out clearly enough, but that was precisely the point of the example, is that there is a particular demographic. So even though Taylor Swift does not have the algorithms at her disposal, she doesn't need them, she knows the complexion of her audience. She can be fairly confident that they will be within a certain age group, that when they are within a particular age group, they will behave a certain way, that they might be more susceptible if they're within sort of young adolescence to late adolescence. And then her followers in other age groups, maybe she can't know that. But so long as she's addressing herself to a particular sub-demographic within the larger demographic, and she can be fairly confident about how it's likely to respond to an appeal to vote, then it seems like she's got the targeting down already, so without the algorithms. So she knows who her supporter base is, if I could put it in those party political terms, and she knows how to reach them. It's quite easy, and she knows also, well, she can assume that they will, they'll either take up the offer or not, but if they do take it up, there'll be large enough numbers of them that they could swell to a certain critical mass that could make a small difference. Although that is an empirical question, and Dan is absolutely right that we don't have a study, but that's forthcoming in 5 years' time. Someone's going to do a PhD on it. So that it was meant to be the point of the example. What else can I say about the transparency point that was made down here? That's also a very good point as well. I mean, when you see your screen and it says go out and vote, or go out and vote with a smiley face, you don't know what other people are seeing. And maybe you've received that message because you've been targeted as a particular demographic. You don't know that. So there is that, whereas in the Swift case, you think, well, she's entitled to express her view, she's entitled to implore people to vote, and there's less of this opacity around it because it's targeted without the use of algorithms, but in a way that is kind of, we would say, fair game. That's just part and parcel of what it is to be a celebrity. So maybe there's something cultural going on that makes that example less opaque than the algorithm in the Facebook example. Quantity versus quality. So I think there's that famous line, I think it's attributed to Pascal, who said, "Sorry I wrote you such a long letter." I didn't have time to write a short one.
Yeah.
I think it's Pascal, but
Great.
if it's not Pascal, it's Voltaire, because almost anything good like that was Pascal, Voltaire, or Oscar Wilde. So it's one of those three. My favourite quote of Oscar Wilde is, "Only the shallow know themselves." But to the point about quantity and quality, if AI can do what Dan was saying, where it can reduce an awful lot of gobbledygook into an easily manageable, digestible chunk of information, then praise be for that. From the question, though, I got the sense that you were thinking AI is just producing lots of information, not good quality information. But there are cases and cases. So we can think of cases where actually the AI helps a lot in reducing the information to something manageable that doesn't make as onerous a demand on our cognition. And then there are examples where, yes, if you do a Google search, you'll get loads and loads of information and you have to start sorting through it. So I think it's, if I haven't misunderstood you, I think that quality and quantity are, the problem of too much information is not something that uniquely bedevils AI, and AI can actually be harnessed to reduce cognitive overload as well. I can probably answer some more, but maybe we should.
If you have one more thing you'd like to say as your last word for the evening, then say that, and then we'll move on.
Overall, I know the theme is democracy. Overall, I am encouraged by the possibility of using AI to make democracy more participatory, even if it's just an algorithm. If we went to a society where instead of having, let's say, the House of Lords, we had some kind of citizen jury system where people were paid a public salary which they could voluntarily take up for, let's say, a fixed period, like a term of 2 years or 3 years, and you used an algorithm to randomly select members of the citizenry, I think that would be a great use of AI. So I'm encouraged by that. But as I say, that's on the democracy front. But more generally, if we're talking about the uses, the positive and beneficial uses of AI, I'm astounded that someone could study protein folds their entire life and not come within an inch of the discoveries that DeepMind were able to make using AlphaFold in discovering the structure of certain proteins. That speaks to immense possibility for human well-being and tackling diseases and all sorts of afflictions that we are only too familiar with as humans. So that's the positive spin. I do look forward to something beneficial coming out of technology. There's this guy that you might know of. His name is Aaron Bastani. He wrote a book called Fully Automated Luxury Communism. And I haven't read the book, but I hear it's got quite a following in Silicon Valley. And Aaron Bastani speaks on Novara Media. It's a news organisation that he founded or co-founded. And that certainly sounds appealing to me.
Okay, there. It's nice to have an optimistic note to finish on. So Dan, again, try and answer some of those and also give us your final thoughts for the evening within about 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll also give a very unpopular, optimistic take on AI. So to the point about a moral panic, I do view it as a moral panic. I think these things happen in a repeated way over history. You know, video games come along and people think, oh my God, video games are turning young adolescent males violent and it's going to be a catastrophe. You see this sort of narrative emerging all of the time, and I think social media is an example of that. as we're seeing with all of the discourse surrounding adolescence at the moment, which I think was in and of itself an excellent TV show, but I think rest on very dubious assumptions about the causal impact of social media on misogyny and violence, which I don't think have really any compelling evidence in support of them. On this point about Yuval Noah Harari, this bestseller who advances these takes, I mean, I think he's a perfect example of what I mentioned in my opening remarks of a public intellectual who gets an enormous amount of attention by pushing catastrophizing narratives that simply aren't supported by evidence. I mean, you mentioned this idea that the algorithm determines what we see. I think there's a way of interpreting that where it's true, but it shouldn't really alarm us that much. And there's a way of interpreting that where I think it's excessively alarmist and not supported by the evidence. For example, I think many people have this idea that there are otherwise ordinary people who have, basically normie opinions, and then they go onto TikTok or X and they effectively slip on a banana peel, fall down a rabbit hole, and now they believe in QAnon. It's just not how it works. There's an enormous amount of research now showing that the kinds of people that find themselves in these extremist, conspiratorial corners of the internet aren't being pushed there by algorithms. They're seeking out that content because it aligns with pre-existing attitudes and beliefs. And those beliefs have always existed within society. So we talk now about the era of conspiracy theories. What this is an era where people who were previously sheltered from segments of society that were highly conspiratorial are now being exposed to the fact that those segments of society exist. I don't think there's any good evidence that social media algorithms are increasing the virality and impact of conspiracy theories in society at large. So I recognize it's a very contrarian take, but I think it's the take which is best supported by the evidence. And then maybe just one final thing on this issue of deepfakes. I think it's a very common view when people say, well, now we're going to enter this world, or maybe we already enter this world, where we can create this hyper-realistic audio or video recordings, so nobody's going to trust anything that they encounter. And I just think it's not true. I mean, I know that deepfakes exist, but if the BBC publishes a video of something, it's not as if I think, well, I can't trust anything. No, because I think the BBC on narrow factual matters is broadly speaking reliable. And I think if other outlets are triangulating on the same story and reporting similar things, even though I know that deepfakes exist, I'm still going to trust in the information. And it's worth noting, throughout all of human history, the primary mode of communication is linguistic. And it's always been possible just to make things up with language, but no one thinks, well, therefore we can't trust what anyone says, because we've got all of these sophisticated ways, psychological, social, institutional, of evaluating communication and of making honesty and trustworthiness emerge in certain kinds of contexts. So that's all my way of saying, I think that, to this moral panic point, the discourse surrounding social media and AI on democracy, I think is characterized by lots of alarmist cliches which aren't actually supported by evidence. And I'm not saying there's nothing to worry about. I do think there are specific things to worry about. But my overarching worry is that because we get distracted by this alarmist discourse, we actually end up not carefully and rigorously thinking about those specific worries. That's my final point.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Lucy, you get the final word, so if you could answer any remaining questions you've been mopping up, give us your final thoughts within about 4 or 5 minutes.
Excellent.
And then you're the only thing between us and the bar, that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I know, and a gin and tonic, I know. Gosh, I think it's fair to say I'd be delighted if it's a moral panic. In 5 years, if I watch this, I mean, I'm unlikely to watch this video in 5 years, but if I do, I'm like, I was talking rubbish, it's all been fine. I'd be so pleased. So, but I'm not sure, if I'm honest. I think this has a different, I think this is slightly different from previous moral panics. So I take your point completely about things like video games. I wanted to make a quick point to this lady about political donations. The thing about businesses making political donations, and I get the analogy you're drawing, is that those are usually in the public domain. And as an empowered, informed citizen, you can use your consumer power to buy that product or to not do so, specifically because they support a party or a political position that you don't agree with. And I imagine many people in this room have used that power. I wanted to really quickly talk about deepfakes. away from democracy, my primary concern about deepfakes is that it's another form of sexual violence against women and girls. And I think that could also have a chilling effect on women entering politics and the public sphere. So I don't want to, that's not the subject of tonight, but it's a huge issue and truly alarming, actually. The main thing I wanted to come to, though, is this, a few people mentioned transparency, data sharing, open access, and also, and I can't remember who said it, it was a gentleman, talked about essentially tech leaders controlling information and they're, maybe not who we want to be in control of information. And I am going to make a shameless plug for Wikipedia, which is in the top 5 most used websites in the world. It's the only non-profit website in the top 70. Wikipedia will be 25 years old next January. It's a quarter of a century old, and it is still not for sale, unlike other tech companies. And there's a huge amount of transparency that's embedded into the site. You can look at the talk page on every article and you can see the history, every single edit that's been made, you have access to. It's worth noting that most large language models have been trained on Wikipedia, and that's for good and bad, because Wikipedia has an inbuilt mechanism for feedback and change and updating and improving, which once that data has been scraped, regurgitated somewhere without that feedback mechanism, and potentially behind a paywall and not attributed, that's using that information in a very different kind of way. But the main point I wanted to end on is that, if you're looking for transparency, if you're looking for open access, if you're looking for something that's not for sale, then please continue to use and support Wikipedia.
What an absolutely shameless plug, and what a great note to end on. So please thank the panel and yourselves for really interesting questions and points. As Maya said, this is the last in this series of AI debates, but I have no doubt that we will revisit the general area as we have in the past. So if you have thoughts on what we should discuss, maybe tell Maya. And meanwhile, let us go out and continue the discussion informally in an unmediated, human-to-human way. And thank you all again for coming. And people watching on YouTube, thank you for watching to the end. Hope you enjoyed it.